Okay, so Doug, if you could go to the next slide. I thought we'd start with a couple of just background slides. The first is kind of why all the fuss about cybersecurity? Why does this matter to us? And I would say it matters for a few reasons. First, if Doug, you'll click through, as when I say we here, I mean not just me, but everyone on this panel, everyone on this webinar. We deal with personally identifiable information, or PII. Very confidential stuff that, as we know, has a propensity to be leaked out. And number two, we deal with this not only for one person, for ourselves, but we do it for many thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands. In Definiti's case, we have hundreds of thousands of plan participants' information that is out there. Second thing, coupled with that, is that the retirement industry collectively comprises something like $9.3 trillion in assets. That's trillion with a T. So it's a massive amount of money, together with a lot of personally identifiable information. And finally, this information historically probably hasn't been locked down by many of the small TPAs in the country as well as it should have been. So you put those four things together: information, a lot of it; money, a lot of that; and perhaps some lax security standards historically, and it attracts the bad guys. And we are certainly seeing that happen. Doug, if you can go to the next slide. Now, the landscape is changing because, frankly, fraud and thieves have been around as long as time itself. But what has changed, and this has really happened over the last 5 to 10 years and seems to be accelerating, is that in the old days, our biggest threat was from individual fraudsters impersonating someone else in order to treat that person's retirement accounts like an ATM. That's on the left-hand side. So the bad guy comes in, pretends to be somebody else, takes a distribution or withdrawal, and the money's gone. What's happened more recently is that organizations are increasingly using tools to break into entire companies' data and do this thieving on a wholesale basis. So that really upped the game. Things like ransomware, et cetera, have become a growing problem. We all read about that in the news, and hopefully we're not seeing it in our own personal life, but this session and the ones that follow are there to help you combat this changing landscape. Next slide, please. This has not gone unnoticed. In fact, after many years of no public pronouncements, just this past April, and if you can click through to the next couple of clicks, just this past April, the Department of Labor came out with two very interesting and useful documents. The first is the tips for hiring a service provider with strong cybersecurity practices. And the second is a document called Cybersecurity Program Best Practices. Each of these is something that you'll hear a lot about today. I won't speak too much to them directly in these comments because I think they will be covered later on. But I wanted to make you aware that they exist, that they came out recently in April, and that they are, in contrast to many things in our industry, quite readable. And we do encourage you to read them and understand what's in them. They do represent some interesting and effective efforts to lock down cybersecurity. So with that, let me enter into our CyberChat and introduce Terry with me as well. And I think what we're going to do is try to set this up so that you can see us more than the slide, if you've got it set to the active speaker view. And Terry, why don't I kick it off with a question to you? You've been sitting in the hot seat for several years now with Definiti. Could you tell us some of the ways that you and Definiti have looked at how to safeguard information for cybersecurity practices?
I really appreciate you asking, Tom, because, you know, security is an important issue to me, and it's important to all of us. In fact, it's been a priority for us since the very beginning of Definiti as a company. We understand that our customers place a tremendous amount of trust in us. Our business partners place a tremendous amount of trust in us every day. And our employees continually work hard to try to earn and maintain that trust. Security is just a piece of that, but it's an important piece. Definiti sources our software applications from some of the largest financial technology services vendors in the industry. In fact, wherever possible, we will license that software on a subscription basis so that it's managed by those vendors. Each of those vendors has very strict policies and things that they do from a security standpoint. So much so that they have a lot of third-party assessments, a lot of things like that. They regularly conduct risk assessments of their environment. And we will do risk assessments of those environments as well. We've also made the decision to move all of our information assets into a highly secure cloud-based environment. That's an important piece as well. We actually selected a cloud environment that's used by the CIA, and more recently, the United Kingdom intelligence agencies have selected that particular cloud vendor in order to provide services. We selected a national IT managed service provider to maintain our technology infrastructure. This IT service provider will maintain our software, our network equipment, keep it up to date with the latest cybersecurity patches. Another reason we selected this particular vendor, though, was that they also have a dedicated security operations center. And that SOC team, as it's called, SOC team, is tasked with monitoring our systems around the clock. That's a big deal because we know that people can break in at any time. This SOC team also maintains their expertise because they participate in an organization called InfraGuard, which is a partnership between the FBI and the members of the private sector. And with that partnership, they have an ongoing dialogue and they communicate on cybersecurity threats, what's coming out, what's a new threat that's out, what's a new vulnerability that has occurred. That's an important piece because that way they stay up to date on the most current things that are happening. What are the emerging technologies? What are the emerging threats? But we can't just rest our laurels there. We also engage a third-party security firm, at least annually, to attempt to gain access to our systems, just like a hacker would. If they find any vulnerability assessments, we're very quick about looking at those, figuring out how to correct those, and we correct those weaknesses. But one of the things I really want to emphasize, I talked about how our employees work hard every day to maintain the trust of our customers and our business partners. We also recognize that for Definiti, and really for any company, the employees are the weakest link. We conduct mandatory security awareness training for every one of our employees on a monthly basis. In addition, we do random phishing email tests to every employee every week. We do that in order to maintain their awareness of what's going on. If an employee happens to click on one of those links, then we send them through additional security training because, again, we understand the importance of the awareness and how it's got to be top of mind. Those employees are our front line of defense. And we see that, and we want them to be alert and want them to be aware. So Tom, let me ask you something. I mentioned that cybersecurity has been important for Definiti since the very beginning. But then again, one of the things we need to recognize is every minute, every dollar that Definiti, or for that matter, any company, spends on security is time and money that we can't spend on growing the company. So how does a CEO make a decision on spending money on cybersecurity?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question, one that we think about a lot, especially this time of year as we're looking at budgeting and going into next year. Definiti is a high growth company. We spend a lot of money on staff. We have a lot of competing needs for resources. Information technology is one of them. But for all of us who work in a field where we're involved with confidential and sensitive information, there's really no choice, is the first answer. These are table stakes. To protect the information that your clients entrust you with is something that just has to be addressed. I lived through this in my years in the banking industry, saw the increasing regulation, didn't always like it, frankly, but saw it coming and saw how our company and other companies worked to address it. And at the end of the day, we were much safer as a result. And that's just starting to happen here in the retirement industry. So it's not a question of whether to spend or not. You have to spend. In our case, we spend well over $2 million a year just for our company to keep our company safe. And that's just hard costs, meaning the cost to vendors for training, et cetera. The other question is, how do you know when to stop, right? Because literally one could spend an unlimited amount. And so the assessment process is one that's so important. Every company is different. Every information technology infrastructure is different. So really evaluating where the weak links are and having the right tools and processes in place are important. So Terry, you spoke about two of the most important ones, which is really no surprise since this is how you spend your days. Maybe interestingly, it's not so much in the infrastructure as it is the people who are the weakest link, the people who don't change their passwords or who pick weak ones, the people who increasingly are exposed to threats from phishing attacks, et cetera. That's where actually a large amount of our spend has to go. And much of that spend is not quantified. We do testing regularly. In fact, we do it weekly, as well as the testing that occurs on a formal basis every month. And we don't even try to quantify the staff time on that and how much we're spending, because frankly, it doesn't matter. We just need to do it. So that employee training piece is critical. And then the second piece, it gets around trying to find who are the right vendors who can bolster the process. And you spoke about this as well. We in our company have a strong focus on picking the leading vendors who we know are making those investments, working with them directly to make sure that they continue to enhance their own security. So those are two pieces. And then finally, the third piece, which we haven't talked about as much, is if you've got your information assets in a safe place, as we do, how do you make sure all the nuts and bolts are being done? The security patches and upgrades being done regularly, the backup and recovery testing happening. That's kind of mundane housekeeping, but it absolutely has to be done. So putting the investment behind that, number three, are the three pieces. So short answer to your question, you got to spend the money. And the question is, what's the right place to spend it in that's going to have the highest impact? And those are some of the places in which we've done that. I'm watching the clock, and I wanted to get in one more question at least before we finish. And so, Terry, I'll ask you, our audience today is financial advisors. Financial advisors, by and large, work in financial firms where their own information assets are secured by industry experts. How can they, though, work with their clients, with our clients? How can they encourage them? What's the right way for them to encourage their clients, the small business owner, about the importance of information security and what best to do?
I think one of the things that financial advisors can recognize is that their clients, the plan sponsors, they look to those financial advisors for their expertise. And honestly, because they develop relationships with them, with those particular companies, they can bring a lot of different things to the table that they may or may not have true expertise in, but they can certainly ask their customers. They can say, what are you doing on security? Because those customers need to recognize that as well. And so I think that's one important thing that they can do is begin the conversation with those with their customers. They also have to emphasize the importance of cybersecurity to those customers, and honestly, even in the selection that they do of vendors, of TPAs, for example, that are looking to do business with them. I can't emphasize strongly enough that even if you're not an expert on security, and honestly, no one would really expect you to be, but you can read the DOL guidelines. You can contact the TPAs that you use, the ones that are serving your clients, and you can ask them for their written response to those guidelines. Because if someone doesn't have a written response or a satisfactory response, that ought to tell you something. I mean, you really need to consider whether you ought to be maintaining your client's data with that particular firm. Anything that TPA does that happens to fail from an information security standpoint and impacts your client, honestly, it impacts you. It's going to impact your reputation. They're going to see that. And that's something that you need to be very aware of. We guard our reputation very strongly at Definiti. And I know that each financial advisor does as well, because of the trust that your clients, your customers put in you. And so those are the types of things that I would really, really emphasize.